Hey everybody, it's Ela, and I knit, crochet, and I'm continuing on my watercolor painting theme. In my last video, I compared watercolor paper, different brands of watercolor paper. This is a great test. However, it would be interesting to see what happens with these same papers when you use techniques that we use all the time when we paint in watercolor, particularly wet into wet techniques. Before I start, I am using Cinelli Bright Red. They do not say what pigment is on there. I did some research. Usually they'll give you a code so you know exactly which pigments are inside, but these guys are keeping it a secret. But it is very bright red. It reminds me a lot of cadmium red deep, maybe a tiny bit cooler. The second one is Prussian blue, and it's Winsor Newton brand. So when I do wet into wet techniques with two colors, that's going to be my second color. By the way, I love this brush. This is Raphael, it's imitation squirrel. They call this a quill style brush. You can see it's got this kind of wrapping around the top. And this is a size 2. I'm not sponsored. This is all just stuff that I happen to own and love. So, getting started.
This first paper is Canson XL watercolor paper. And I'm laying down a bunch of squares showing off different types of wet into wet techniques. This first square has some salt that I just sprinkled on there. Next I'm going to put some drops of clear water. Then I'm going to lay down some water and put some drops of paint on top. And then I'm going to show what happens when you lay different colors and water and wet paint side by side. You'll notice I'm absorbing some of this excess paint. Cheap papers are made out of wood pulp or cellulose, and they don't absorb paint well. They also don't have a lot of texture to them, which means that paint just doesn't flow very well on it. When I put these little dots on this clear part that I just laid down, you'll notice that those dots are really tiny and they're not flowing outward. And when I lay the water and the colors side by side, because there's just way too much water and paint, they kind of flow together in kind of a crazy, uncontrolled way. This is really common for cheap papers, and I find that Canson XL is particularly bad this way. Something else that happens in this particular sample is we have what I call a bad dog moment. You put the paper away for a little while, and when you go back to it, you'll notice that the dog has pooped on the floor. The equivalent of a dog pooping on the floor. You turn your back, you leave the dog alone, and it's tearing up the couch. But we'll see that in just a little bit. Second one here is fluid watercolor paper. This one is also a wood pulp cellulose paper. And you can see this paper in particular is having trouble with resistance, that little white spot in that second square. The paper is literally pushing away the paint. And watercolor paper is supposed to do one thing, and that is to accept paint. If the paper doesn't accept paint, we got a problem. So, yeah, it's pretty frustrating. I try and fix it a little bit here. There it is. Try and fix it, but look, it just begins to push it away again, and it still looks bad when it dries. These 4 dots are flowing out a little bit better than with the Canson XL, but it's still, you're getting what you're paying for. It's not an expensive paper. I mostly use it because it comes in a cute little pad, which I will show you at the end. And it's good enough for just playing around, but I would never do a serious painting with this paper. So, wet into wet here. And it looks really neat now, but later on these are going to flow. It's already beginning to flow pretty dramatically between the two parts. You'll see that with arches and with Fabriano, those two parts stay a little bit more separate and more controlled. Laying down some water, wow! You can really see how the paper is not absorbing the paint, and it's just getting a little out of control. Here's that bad dog moment. Look at how the blue and the red have flown together. I can try and fix it, but no, there's no fixing that. It's just too much. And that's the only paper of all of these that had that problem. This last paper is my favorite. This is Arch's watercolor paper. You'll notice that this paper and Fabriano are both rougher than the cheaper papers. I actually really love this texture. When I feel it, it makes me happy. I can tell I'm going to have a good time painting on it. And you can actually see this texture through the paint. You can see these little white dots. They'll be even more apparent as I continue. Arches goes back to 1492. I believe Fabriano goes back to the 1300s. These papers have been around for a very, very long time, although they have changed hands from different companies. They're still basically the same papers, and this is why most artists prefer to use these papers. If this paper was a dog, it would be best in show. It can do any trick you want. It'll play dead. You can put a treat on its nose. It won't move. It's very, very reliable. Arches does use gelatin. It's, I believe, the only paper that uses gelatin in the sizing. So if you're a vegetarian or vegan and you want a really good paper, I would go with Fabriano, since they use a synthetic sizing rather than a gelatin sizing.
Okay, so all the paper is now dry, and we have here on the left the Canson XL, which, by the way, looks like this. And for fluid, this is what I have for fluid. This is why I use it, because it's hard to find a good notebook with watercolor paper. And while it's not great watercolor paper, if you want to travel around and do some sketches and have it all kept together in one place, it's a nice journal. Oh, by the way, this is 8 by 8 inches. Most of the time I see 6 by 6 inch versions of this, but I like this size if you can find it. So, yeah, here's the bad dog moment. And we've got some back runs in here. And back runs are in a lot of these papers. Usually when I paint, I'm not racing through and painting them one right after the other. But the back runs are definitely worse with the cheaper papers. We've got some resistance going on in a number of different places. There's another back run, and of course the Holy Mother back run right there. Not a good time, but you know, if you want to save some money and you don't mind having some unpredictability, you know, if you just want a cute dog to play with, even if it poops on the floor, you can do that. Just don't expect it to sit or do any of the tricks that you want with any sort of regularity. So that's the deal with Canson XL and fluid watercolor paper. And by the way, here's a picture of what fluid watercolor paper looks like in a regular pad. Here we have the Blick watercolor paper. Resistance is futile. Look at that. The resistance keeps happening. I think the only one that has no resistance is Arches. Nice salt work. This, by the way, all these cool little shapes that you get up in the corner, little showing off the fireworks of the salt. Salt is so much fun. It's always a little unpredictable. You never know what's going to happen, but it is fun. I love salt. Try it if you haven't done it before. So once again, this is the Blick. It looks pretty good, except for all that stupid resistance. Makes me mad. Here's what Blick looks like when you look for it in stores. Here's our Fabriano. Hey Fabriano. Salt effect was maybe a little bit less exciting. Like I said, it's unpredictable. And here's my favorite of all time, Arches cold press. And zero resisting, zero back runs. Everything's just kind of swirling around beautifully. I love you, Arches. Will you be mine forever? A little bit of salt got around, but it's kind of cool. It's all right. It's watercolor. And I have lots of examples of what this paper looks like. This is it in the pad, but it's glued on top. It doesn't have that cool ringed binding that will let you flip through the pages and keep them all in one place. I also have a very beat up block to show you if you guys have ever seen these before. So watercolor blocks are a little bit more expensive, but they hold the paper flat because of the glue that's painted on the sides. So you just paint on it, everything stays nice and flat, you don't get as many back runs, and you just let it dry. And when the painting is done or mostly done, then at that point, then you stick a knife or fingernail into that top little bit right here and just remove that top sheet. There it is, just in that little piece right there. You pop that off, and then you have a fresh new sheet of paper underneath. So if you enjoyed this video today, please like, subscribe. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.